They say one small decision can change your whole life, and I never believed that until the day I missed my doctor's appointment, not because I forgot or overslept, but because I stopped to help a little boy who was standing alone on the sidewalk, crying so quietly it almost broke my heart. My name is Rachel. I'm 37 years old, and I thought I had my life all figured out, or at least I was managing to keep it from falling apart. But I had no idea that a boy I'd never seen before, and a man I didn't know existed, would soon pull me into a story so tangled with charm and lies that it would take everything I had just to find myself again on the other side. That morning started like any other, with me rushing out the door after getting my mother settled with her tea and medication, throwing my keys into my oversized purse while mentally calculating how long it would take to get across town to the clinic. I remember the sky being overcast, a dull gray that matched the way I'd been feeling for months, tired, stretched too thin, and quietly resigned to a life that seemed to shrink more every year. My mother had been sick for a long time, and I had put everything else on hold to take care of her, my job, my health, and definitely my dating life, which now felt like something that had belonged to a different person in a different decade. I had finally made an appointment with a specialist after weeks of pushing it aside, thinking maybe it was time I put my own name back on the list of things worth taking care of. But just as I turned onto Rosewood Avenue, cutting through a quieter neighborhood to avoid traffic, I saw him, a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing next to a tall wooden fence near the corner, his hands gripping the straps of a little blue backpack, his eyes wide and watery, and his lips trembling like he didn't know what to do or where to go. I slowed down without thinking, pulling over and rolling down the window as I called out to him gently, asking if he was okay. At first, he didn't say anything, just stared at me like he wasn't sure if I was real. Then he whispered something I could barely hear, but it sent a chill down my spine. He couldn't find his dad. I parked the car and got out, crouching beside him, trying to make my voice as soft as I could while I asked his name and where he'd last seen his father. He said his name was Jamie and that they were walking to the park when he stopped to tie his shoe. And then, just like that, his dad was gone. I told him we'd figure it out together, and he nodded, like he wanted to believe me, even if he wasn't quite sure. I glanced at the time on my phone. My appointment was in 20 minutes. If I left now, maybe I could still make it, but looking into that child's face, seeing how small and alone he looked on that big empty sidewalk, I couldn't walk away. I called the non-emergency number just in case someone had reported him missing, and then I took him to the little cafe across the street to wait. The one with the blue awning and the warm cinnamon smell that drifted through the door every time someone opened it. We sat in a corner booth, and I ordered him a hot chocolate with whipped cream and sprinkles. He held the cup with both hands, still not saying much, but the color started coming back into his cheeks, and he relaxed just a little when I made a silly face to try to make him laugh. I kept watching the door, hoping someone would walk in, looking panicked, and searching for a little boy in a striped jacket. But the minutes ticked by, and no one came. Eventually, I got a call back. Someone matching the father's description had checked in at a nearby station, asking if anyone had seen a boy with a blue backpack. Just as I hung up, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and a man walked in, and that was the moment everything shifted, though I didn't know it yet. He was tall, dressed in a clean but slightly rumpled gray button-up, his dark hair a little messy, like he'd been running his hands through it all morning, and when his eyes landed on Jamie sitting across from me in that booth, I saw them widen with such raw relief that I felt it in my chest. He rushed over, dropped to his knees beside the table, and wrapped his arms around the boy, murmuring that he was sorry, that he'd looked everywhere, that he shouldn't have walked so fast ahead. Jamie clung to him, whispering that he thought his dad had left him, and my heart tightened as I watched the two of them together. The man looked up at me then, his eyes soft but tired, and said, "Thank you," not just once, but again and again, with this quiet sincerity that caught me off guard. He offered to pay for the drink, asked if I needed anything, then told me his name was David. And before I could answer, he added, almost shyly, that I'd done more than help his son. I'd given him back something he didn't even know he'd nearly lost. Then he smiled, and I remember thinking that it had been a long time since someone looked at me like I mattered. Not as a caretaker, not as a daughter, but just me. What I didn't know in that moment was that David would become part of my life faster than I ever thought possible, and that the same hands that reached out in gratitude would one day quietly take everything I thought I could trust. The next time I saw David was 2 days later, and it wasn't planned, at least not by me. I was standing in line at the grocery store, holding a basket with frozen soup, a loaf of whole grain bread, and my mom's favorite lemon cookies, when I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned around to see the same warm smile from the cafe, the one I hadn't been able to get out of my mind. No matter how much I told myself, it had just been a kind thank you and nothing more. He was holding a bag of apples and a bunch of celery, wearing a navy hoodie this time, his hair still a little wild but charming in that unpolished way, and before I could say anything, he said he'd been hoping to run into me again. He asked how I'd been, if everything was okay, and said Jamie hadn't stopped talking about the cookie lady since that day at the cafe. I laughed at that, feeling my cheeks warm, and we stood there talking until the cashier called me forward. He offered to walk me to my car, and for some reason, I said yes, even though I usually preferred to do things on my own, even though I wasn't used to someone offering help without a hidden reason. Maybe it was because I had spent so long being the one who carried the weight, the one who never asked for anything, that the simple act of someone offering to walk me to my car felt almost luxurious. At the car, he didn't rush off. He leaned against the passenger side door and asked if I liked coffee, the good kind, not the watery stuff most places served. When I said yes, he smiled like he'd just won something and told me there was a little place 2 blocks away that roasted their beans fresh every morning and made cinnamon mochas that were apparently life-changing. I could have said no. I should have said no. I had errands to run, laundry to do, and my mother's prescriptions to refill. But instead, I said, okay. We sat outside on a little patio surrounded by potted herbs and weathered wood chairs, sipping coffee that really was as good as he'd promised. He told me about Jamie, about how he'd lost his wife 2 years ago in a sudden and cruel twist of fate that left them both broken in different ways, and how he'd been trying ever since to hold things together for his son. I told him about my mother, about how I'd put my life on pause to be her full-time caregiver, and how some days I wasn't even sure who I was anymore outside of that role. We talked for hours, long after our cups were empty and the sun had started to dip behind the trees. It was easy, natural, the way some conversations just flow when both people have been silent for too long in their lives, and finally find someone who's willing to listen. And when he asked if we could do this again, maybe dinner next time, I didn't hesitate. I gave him my number, and for the rest of that day I walked a little lighter, smiled a little easier, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other more and more. It started with short coffee dates, then long evening walks around the park, sometimes with Jamie running ahead of us, laughing as he pointed out squirrels and ducks, and every rock he found interesting. Other times, it was just the two of us, sitting in his backyard with a glass of wine, watching the sky shift from blue to orange, while he asked me questions no one had asked in years, about what I wanted, what I used to dream about, what made me happy before life got heavy. He never rushed me, never pushed too hard. He was gentle in a way that felt real, like he wasn't trying to impress me, but simply wanted to know me, and I didn't even notice how easily I let him in until one night, about a month after we met, when I caught myself humming while folding laundry, smiling for no reason at all. My mother noticed, too. She said I looked different, lighter, like something in me had shifted, and I told her, not everything, not yet, but enough that she smiled and said, Maybe it was finally my turn. By the time David officially asked me to be his girlfriend, using those exact words with a boyish grin that made me laugh, it already felt like we were a team. Jamie had started calling me Miss Rachel in a way that sounded more like family than formality, and I'd started leaving a toothbrush at David's house without even realizing I was doing it. I still spent most of my time at home with my mother, still handled the grocery runs, and medicine refills, and sleepless nights. But now, there was something to look forward to at the end of it all. Someone who made me feel like I was more than just the person holding everything together. And maybe that's why I didn't see it coming. Maybe I was so desperate to feel something good again, so hungry for connection and warmth, that I ignored the little warning signs. The way he sometimes changed the subject when I asked about his job. The phone calls he stepped outside to take. The way his sister, who visited once from out of town, looked at me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I brushed it all aside because I wanted to believe in the version of the story where the lonely woman meets the kind-hearted widower, and they build something beautiful together. But fairy tales don't always end the way we want them to, and sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in kindness. It was early spring when David gave me the key to his house, not as a grand romantic gesture with candles or speeches, but in the quiet way he always did things, sliding it across the kitchen counter one evening, while Jamie sat on the floor in the living room, carefully arranging dominoes into long, winding trails that he later planned to knock over with dramatic flair. The house smelled like roasted vegetables and rosemary. The soft hum of music, Pite de my maison, played from a speaker tucked behind the toaster, and David leaned against the counter, watching me with that half-smile I was beginning to crave more than I wanted to admit. He said the key was just for convenience, for mornings when I came by early, or evenings when I stayed late, but his eyes held a question he didn't say aloud, and I felt my breath catch in my throat because I knew exactly what he was really asking. I picked up the key, turning it over in my hand slowly, the metal still warm from his touch, and before I could stop myself, I said, maybe it was time I stayed a little longer, not every night, not all at once, but enough to start figuring out what life together might really look like. He smiled, stepped forward, and kissed my forehead in that soft, grounding way of his, like he was sealing something between us, something that didn't need words to feel real. That night, I slept in his bed while Jamie fell asleep in the next room, with a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship glowing gently against the wall. And I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally stepped into something good, something solid. But sometimes, even in the sweetest moments, life throws you a shadow, something so sudden and sharp that it slices right through your calm and leaves you gasping, even if nothing actually happens in the end. That moment came 3 days later, and I still think about it sometimes, how close it felt to unraveling everything. It was a Thursday evening, and David was working late. Jamie had been extra quiet all day, not sullen, but not quite himself either, and I figured maybe it was just the weather or a long day at school. We had just finished dinner. Mac and cheese, with peas stirred in, his favorite, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was already past 8, but I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to the door, calling over my shoulder for Jamie to stay at the table. When I opened it, a woman stood there, mid-40s, maybe older, short red hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, expensive-looking coat, sharp eyes. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She just asked, in a clipped tone, if David was home. I told her he wasn't, asked if she wanted to leave a message, and for a second she just stared at me, really stared, like she was trying to decide if she should say what she came to say. Then she laughed under her breath, shook her head slightly, and muttered, "Of course he wouldn't be." She turned to leave, then paused, glanced back over her shoulder, and added, "Tell him Charlotte stopped by. He'll know what that means." She was gone before I could ask anything else. her heels tapping down the walkway like punctuation. I closed the door slowly, heart beating faster than it should have, and for a long moment I just stood there with my hand still on the knob, replaying every word in my head. When I turned around, Jamie was standing in the hallway, watching me with wide eyes, and I forced a smile, told him everything was fine, just someone looking for the wrong address. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. When David came home later, I tried to sound casual as I mentioned the visitor. His expression froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice, then softened again as he said, Charlotte was an old family friend, someone who used to be close with his late wife and had a hard time letting go of the past. He apologized for the awkward encounter, said she could be intense sometimes, and kissed the top of my head like that would erase the unease curling inside my chest. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I nodded, let it go, and tucked that strange moment away in the back of my mind, telling myself that not every shadow meant a storm was coming. After all, nothing happened. She left. He explained. Jamie laughed at bedtime like always. Life continued. And yet, something had shifted. Not between us, not yet, but somewhere deep inside me. A seed of doubt had been planted, and even though I tried to ignore it, I could feel it waiting, just below the surface, quiet but patient, like it knew its moment would come. But that night, when David reached for my hand as we lay in bed and Jamie's soft breathing filled the room across the hall, I closed my eyes and leaned into the warmth, choosing, at least for now, to believe in the version of the story where everything still felt safe. It had been just under 3 months since the day I met Jamie on the sidewalk and found myself pulled into their quiet little world, and yet somehow it felt like I had always been there, like the shape of their days had molded around me as easily as if I'd belonged all along. My toothbrush was no longer a visitor on the bathroom counter. It had its own holder now. My slippers stayed tucked beneath the edge of David's bed, and the kitchen drawer next to the sink held a bundle of my mother's recipes, folded neatly beside his measuring spoons. I still went home to check on the house every couple of days, made sure everything was dusted, that her favorite throw, blanket, still held the faint scent of lavender. But more and more, it felt like my life had moved into this new space, this new rhythm, and I was learning how to breathe again. It was a Saturday morning when it happened, one of those rare days in early spring when the air feels softer somehow, the breeze carries that first hint of flowers, and the whole world seems to exhale after holding its breath for months. Jamie had spent the morning building an elaborate pillow fort in the living room, complete with a "No Adults Allowed" sign taped to the blanket flap, and David had dragged me outside with a blanket and a thermos of coffee, insisting we sit on the back deck for a while and enjoy the sun. He didn't act nervous. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic setups, or camera-ready surprises. We just sat there, side by side, with the sound of birds and distant laughter floating on the air, and then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and placed it gently in my hand, like he was handing me something fragile and sacred. I stared at it for a moment, confused, until I looked up and saw the quiet shine in his eyes. Not fear, not pressure, just something soft and steady, like he had made peace with this decision a long time ago and was now waiting to see if I would do the same. He didn't say the usual things, not, "Will you marry me?" not "Spend forever with me." Instead, he said he didn't want to imagine another summer, or another winter, or even another breakfast without me in it. He said Jamie adored me, that I brought something into their home that had been missing since the day they lost his mother, and that for the first time in years, the house felt like it had music in it again. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the wind anymore, and part of me, the careful, cautious part that had spent years taking care of my mother, making measured decisions, walking gently through every room in my life, whispered, that maybe it was too soon, that I barely knew this man, that 3 months was barely enough time to learn someone's favorite cereal, let alone their deepest truths. But another part of me, the one that had been buried under duty and silence and lonely evenings for too long, wanted so desperately to believe that sometimes the good things really did come without warning, that maybe I had finally stumbled into the kind of love other people wrote about in journals and whispered about at dinner tables. So I said yes, and when he slipped the ring onto my finger, a simple gold band with a tiny diamond that caught the sunlight just right, Jamie burst out of the pillow fort shouting, "Are you my new mommy now?" before David could stop him, and we both laughed so hard we couldn't breathe. That night, there were toasts and cake and music playing on the speakers as David held me close in the kitchen, whispering that we'd make a beautiful life, just the three of us, that he would never let me go. And for a moment, I believed it, completely, without hesitation, letting the warmth of his arms and the sound of Jamie's laughter soak through the cracks in my soul. I called my best friend Melissa that night to tell her, and though she was happy for me, genuinely, lovingly happy, I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she asked how long we'd been together. When I said just about 3 months, there was a pause, then a careful, almost rehearsed response. "That's fast, Rach. Just be sure, okay?" I brushed it off with a laugh, promised I wasn't rushing into anything, even though deep down, I knew I was already in too deep to climb back out. Still, the ring sparkled on my hand. The house felt warm and full, and for the first time in years, I went to sleep not thinking about what I'd lost, but about what I'd found. And I didn't know it yet, but that ring would soon feel less like a promise, and more like a warning I didn't recognize until it was far too late. The week after the proposal moved faster than I expected, like life had suddenly picked up momentum and was pulling me along whether I was ready or not. One box became 3, then 7, and before I even realized what I'd done, the hallway closet in David's house held my scarves and boots. My books lined the shelves beside his thrillers and biographies, and my favorite teacup, the one with the chipped edge that used to sit next to my mother's. "Hantise me mad me found. Haun, a na new hutinton home. Gnome," by the sink. Jamie was overjoyed, buzzing with excitement every evening as he helped me unpack, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen, including the neighbor's dog, that I was going to be his new mom. David seemed even calmer now that the decision had been made, like something had clicked into place for him and he no longer needed to prove anything. He worked a little later some nights, but always came home with takeout or a bottle of wine, and kissed me like a man who knew he'd won something precious. I kept telling myself this was what peace felt like. The quiet dinners, the shared chores, the slow rhythm of routines forming around us like vines, gently wrapping a porch. But beneath that soft rhythm, something else had started to settle in too. Small things at first, nothing dramatic or obvious, just little changes in the air, like walking into a room and forgetting why you feel tense. He started locking the downstairs office, said it was for work, confidential papers, nothing to worry about. I told myself that made sense, that everyone needed space. Then there were the days he'd come home distracted, phone buzzing in his pocket, stepping outside to take calls with his back to the window, talking low and fast, like the words might disappear if spoken too loudly. And there was his sister, Elaine, who came to visit for the weekend and never once addressed me by name, instead calling me she or your fiancé in a tone that sounded like the words had something bitter lodged inside them. At dinner, she made a casual comment about how fast things were moving, how David always did have a way of making women feel special, how he was a romantic, just like with Vanessa. I tried to smile, tried to ask more about his late wife, but David quickly changed the subject, saying Jamie shouldn't have to relive those memories at the table. I told myself it was just grief, unresolved, tender, unpredictable, and I didn't push it. I didn't want to be the woman who nagged or demanded. I'd spent too many years holding other people's pain gently in my hands to suddenly start dropping it, just because it made me uncomfortable. So I let it go. Or at least, I tried. Then there was the night when I went looking for a flashlight in the garage and found a locked metal cabinet tucked behind the tool bench. Nothing strange about that, except I remember David once telling me he hated clutter and didn't keep anything valuable out there. When I asked him about it later, he smiled like I'd asked where he kept the Christmas lights and said it was just old paperwork, tax files, boring things he hadn't gotten around to sorting. I nodded, said okay, even though something in his eyes flickered just slightly. Too fast for most people to notice, but I'd spent years reading my mother's face for signs of pain, fear, or confusion, and I knew when someone was hiding something they didn't want to explain. Still, we kept moving forward. The wedding date was set for the fall, small and intimate, nothing big, just family and a few close friends. David insisted on handling most of the planning himself, saying I already had enough to manage. At first, it felt like a sweet gesture, like he was trying to protect me, but over time, I realized I wasn't being asked about much at all. I didn't know which venue he'd chosen. I hadn't seen a guest list. He even gently brushed off my offer to help with invitations, saying they'd already gone out last week, but somehow none of my friends had received one. I pushed the thoughts down, convinced myself I was being paranoid, that not every strange feeling meant danger. I'd seen what it looked like to spiral into suspicion. I'd watched it happen to people who couldn't trust, who couldn't let go of control, and I didn't want to become that woman. I wanted to believe in the version of life I'd been given, the one where love shows up when you least expect it, where broken people heal together, where second chances are real and worth fighting for. So I kept unpacking. I kept smiling. I kept reminding myself that every love story has its shadows, and maybe, just maybe, mine would be different. But in the quiet moments, when I stood alone in the bathroom brushing my teeth and caught my reflection in the mirror, I sometimes saw a flicker of something behind my own eyes, a question I couldn't quite name, a whisper I wasn't ready to hear. And even then, I think I knew that the version of happiness I was clinging to wasn't built on stone, but on something far more fragile. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those days when everything feels slightly out of rhythm for no particular reason. The kind of day when the sky hangs low and heavy, even without rain, and every sound in the house seems louder than it should be. I had just come back from a quick trip to the grocery store, my arms full of produce and Jamie's favorite cereal, when I walked into the kitchen and saw David sitting at the table with a small stack of papers, a pen resting neatly on top, and that same careful, pleasant expression he always wore when he needed something to go his way without much conversation. He stood up to help me unload the bags, kissed me on the cheek, and told me there was something he wanted to run by me. Nothing urgent, just a little thing he'd been meaning to take care of for Jamie's future. I nodded, distracted, half listening as I put the apples into the bowl and reached for the milk. He kept his voice light, almost cheerful, as he explained that he'd talked to a lawyer about creating a legal protection for the house. Something that would ensure, if anything ever happened to either of us, Jamie wouldn't lose his home, wouldn't get caught in some messy situation involving probate or outside claims. He said it was standard, responsible, just one of those adult things couples do to get their affairs in order, especially with a child in the picture. He smiled as he spoke, that soft, steady smile that always seemed to carry more weight than his words, and I could feel the pressure starting to settle behind my eyes before I even looked at the papers. When I sat down and skimmed the first page, the legal terms blurred together. Transfer of interest, trustee, property realignment, and I asked gently what exactly I'd be signing. David leaned forward, placed his hand over mine, and said that it was just a temporary adjustment to the deed, that we were creating a trust where the house would technically be under his name alone for now, but everything was still ours, still shared, just managed differently on paper for Jamie's benefit. He said it was a way to protect me too, to keep us safe from liabilities and outside risk, though he never quite explained what those risks were. I stared at the signature line, my name printed neatly in small capital letters beneath it, and for a moment, my mind drifted back to the cabinet in the garage, to the locked office door, to the way his sister's mouth tightened when she talked about Vanessa. I wanted to ask more questions. I wanted to take the papers to someone I trusted, to read every line slowly and aloud, to sit with them overnight and feel the truth of them in my bones. But the moment I opened my mouth, David gave me this look, soft, a little sad, and said he understood, that if I didn't feel comfortable, we didn't have to do it, but it would mean a lot to him if I trusted him on this, just this once, because everything he was doing was for us, and that's what did it. Because when someone says, for us, with that much certainty, with that much warmth behind their eyes, it's hard not to feel selfish for hesitating. It's hard not to believe that doubt itself might be the betrayal. So I picked up the pen. I signed where he pointed. I smiled back as he kissed my forehead and whispered that we'd made the right choice. He gathered the papers calmly, folded them into a manila envelope, and slid them into his leather briefcase without another word. The next morning, the envelope was gone. He never mentioned it again. But from that day forward, something shifted in the air between us. Not enough to name, not enough to point at, but just enough that I began to notice how often the mail was already sorted before I got to it, how the bank statements no longer arrived in the same place, how the woman at the grocery store started calling me Mrs. Marks before I had ever introduced myself that way. And though I still slept in the same bed, still helped Jamie with homework, still laughed at David's quiet jokes over dinner, I sometimes woke in the middle of the night and lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly the house had stopped feeling like mine and started feeling like some place I was just lucky to be allowed to stay. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet morning that begins with low sunlight stretching through the curtains and the smell of coffee already drifting through the house, except this time, the phone rang before I'd even gotten out of bed, and something in the way it rang, sharp and impatient, made my heart squeeze before I'd even heard the voice on the other end. I knew, somehow I already knew. The nurse on the line spoke gently, her tone soft and clinical, and even though I'd been bracing for that call for months, maybe even longer, the finality of the words still hit me like the world had tilted sideways. My mother had passed in her sleep sometime during the night. Peacefully, they said. No pain, no struggle, just quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed holding the phone to my ear long after the call ended, staring at the floor, the carpet, the sunlight on the window, trying to connect the moment to the weight in my chest, and for a long time, all I could hear was the steady ticking of the hallway clock just outside the room. When David came in and saw me sitting there, he didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He sat beside me, pressed a warm mug of coffee into my hands, and wrapped his arm around my shoulder, and I let my head fall against him, the tears finally slipping down my cheeks in heavy silence. He whispered that she was in a better place now, that I had done everything a daughter could possibly do, that she had left this world knowing she was loved, and for a moment I believed him. Or maybe I just needed to. The funeral was small, as I knew she would have wanted. A few neighbors, an old friend from church, my mother's cousin from another state who couldn't stop crying even though they hadn't spoken in years. David stood beside me the whole time, holding my hand, answering condolences with polite nods, and Jamie, dressed in his little black blazer, clung to my side with a worried frown, asking when we were going back home and whether Grandma was really gone for good. When we returned home, everything felt looked too still. There were no more nightly phone calls to check her breathing, no more lists of prescriptions, no more worrying if she'd eaten enough or whether she was cold. The house was quieter, and for the first time in years I had space in my mind. But instead of feeling free, I felt untethered, like something that had kept me grounded had quietly snapped, and now I was drifting, slowly, and didn't quite know how to stop. At first, David was kind, gentle. He made dinner, poured wine, suggested we take a weekend trip to clear my head, but very quickly, almost too quickly for me to notice the moment it shifted, that warmth began to cool. He stopped asking how I was doing. He stopped waiting for me to speak. He still smiled, still touched my shoulder in passing, still said the right things at the right moments, but it felt more like routine now, like obligation dressed up in comfort. I began to realize that while I was grieving, David was moving forward, almost eagerly, as if now that my last anchor was gone, I would finally settle fully into the life he had built for me. No more loose ends, no more outside ties. The wedding planning resumed almost immediately. He showed me fabric swatches I didn't remember asking for. He confirmed vendors I hadn't heard of. I began to notice that most of the decisions had already been made without me, that my role had shifted from partner to passenger, and every time I asked a question, he would smile just slightly and say, "It's all taken care of, sweetheart. Just relax and enjoy it." He didn't want me going back to my old house anymore, even though I still had boxes to sort through, memories to pack, things that needed closure. He said it was too painful for me, that I needed to let go. And when I pushed back, gently, just once, he got quiet in a way that didn't feel like sadness, but more like control, like he was holding something inside that he didn't plan to say out loud. And then there was the evening when I came into the kitchen and found him on the phone, not whispering, not pacing, just speaking in a tone that was too calm, too measured. And when he noticed me standing in the doorway, he ended the call mid-sentence, slipped the phone into his pocket, and said, "Wrong number." I nodded, but something in me tightened. Not fear, not yet, but a question. The kind that doesn't go away just because you're told it doesn't matter. It happened in the most ordinary way, as these things often do. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no paper dramatically torn in half. Just a moment so small that if I had blinked, I might have missed it entirely. I was sitting in the sunroom, a cup of tea cooling beside me, flipping through the day's mail, the usual stack of grocery flyers, catalogs, and utility bills, when I found an envelope addressed to David from a law firm I didn't recognize. Normally, I wouldn't have opened it. I respected his privacy, even in the small things. But this envelope was already slit open, the papers slightly out of place like they'd been looked at quickly and shoved back inside without care. Something made me pause. Something made me reach in. I told myself I was just straightening it, tidying the stack before handing it to him, but the moment my eyes fell on the first line, confirmation of sole ownership transfer, residential property located at, the air seemed to thin in my lungs. I read it again, slower this time, and then again, as if the words might change. But they didn't. The property listed was our home. The name listed under owner was David. Only David. There was no mention of a trust, no mention of temporary management or protective arrangement. Just a clean, finalized document confirming that the house I thought we shared, the house where my slippers sat by the door, where my books lined the shelves, where my name had once felt carved into the rhythm of the walls, now legally belonged to him, entirely, quietly, permanently. I sat frozen for a long time, staring at the page, my heart thudding so loudly I could hear it over the tick of the nearby clock. I tried to remember the exact words he'd said when he first showed me the papers, the smile on his face, the way he'd wrapped my hand in his as I signed. I thought back to the questions I didn't ask, The terms I didn't understand, but nodded along with anyway, and I felt a slow, deep ache start to rise from somewhere in my chest. Not panic, yet, not betrayal, but something older and heavier. Something like shame. I tucked the papers back into the envelope and placed it exactly where I'd found it, as if undoing the motion could undo the moment, could send me back to 5 minutes ago, when I still believed we were building something real. That evening, I watched him more closely. Not obviously, not in a way he would notice, just little things. The way he casually checked the locks twice before going to bed. The way he glanced at his phone screen before turning it face down. The way he avoided asking me about my day. When I finally asked, gently, what exactly I had signed back then, he didn't answer right away. He poured himself a drink, leaned against the counter, and said he couldn't believe I didn't trust him after everything we'd been through. He reminded me that it was my idea to blend our lives, that I had said I wanted to build a future together, that he had done nothing but make that possible. And then, with a soft shrug that felt like the quietest kind of threat, he said, "It's just a house, Rachel. Why does it matter whose name is on it?" I didn't respond. I just nodded slowly and excused myself to take a bath, locking the door behind me even though I never used to. I sat in the water until it went cold, staring at the ceiling, my hands resting flat on the sides of the tub, and thought about all the things I'd given up in the past 6 months. My home, my name, my boundaries, my voice. And still, something inside me whispered not to react. Not yet. Because this wasn't the moment to fight. This was the moment to listen and start remembering everything. In the weeks that followed, it became harder to pretend I didn't notice the way David had begun to disappear from the edges of our life. Not all at once, not loudly, but gradually, like mist lifting from a field at dawn. So slowly that if you didn't watch carefully, you might believe it was still there. He still came home every night, still said, "Good morning," and "Sleep well," and "What's for dinner?" with the same voice, the same smile, but there was something missing in the way his eyes met mine, like a curtain had dropped behind them, quiet and soft, but firmly drawn. He stopped reaching for my hand in the car. He stopped sitting next to me on the couch. He stopped noticing when I wore something new, or when I stayed up late reading, or when I left the room without saying a word. Jamie still treated me like I was part of the family, curling up beside me after school with his books and puzzles, asking me to help with his backpack or pack his lunch, and every time he did, it twisted something deeper inside me. Because I didn't want to pull away from him, even though it felt like the rest of the house was quietly rejecting me. I loved that boy like he was my own, and yet, day by day, I began to feel like I didn't belong anywhere at all. It started with little things, things that didn't feel important enough to question. My favorite tea was no longer stocked in the pantry. My calendar reminders were removed from the shared kitchen board. The spare key I used to keep in my purse went missing, and when I asked David if he'd seen it, he simply said, "I changed the locks last week, meant to tell you, no big deal." No big deal. He said that a lot now. When I asked why he hadn't come to bed until 3 in the morning, he said it was work, no big deal. When I noticed an unfamiliar bottle of cologne in the downstairs bathroom, he said it was from months ago, no big deal. When I found a receipt for a dinner at a downtown restaurant I'd never heard of, dated for a night when he'd said he was stuck at the office, he said it must have been left in the car from before we met. No big deal. But it was a big deal. All of it. Because I had stopped recognizing the man I had once trusted enough to give up my name, my home, my safety. He had become a stranger wearing a version of the life I had imagined, and every time I tried to speak about it, every time I gently asked what was happening, his answers felt like polished stone, smooth, hard, and impossible to grip. He started inviting his sister over more often, and every time she came, I noticed the way she spoke louder than necessary, the way she took up space that wasn't hers. walking into rooms without knocking, helping herself to drawers I thought were mine. She never looked at me when she talked. It was always through me, around me, past me. Once, I heard them whispering in the kitchen when they thought I was upstairs. Her voice was sharp, his low. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt them like cold wind under a door. And when I stepped into the hallway and made just enough sound to let them know I was near, the whispering stopped instantly, followed by silence thick enough to cut. But still, I stayed, not because I was weak, not because I didn't know better, but because I needed to understand what I was really standing on before I stepped away. Because sometimes, before you leave a house, you have to make sure the foundation is really gone, not just cracked. And I wasn't quite ready to walk. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what I was walking away from. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when the illusion truly began to fall apart, not with a scream or a slammed door, but with a low, careless whisper I was never meant to hear, the kind that floats through the air when people assume they're alone and forget that walls, especially old ones, can listen just as well as any person can. David was in the kitchen, speaking to someone on the phone, and I had just come in from the backyard, moving slowly so I wouldn't interrupt him. But when I heard my name, said in that clipped, businesslike tone he used when he wasn't performing, I stopped just beyond the doorway and stood still, heart thudding in that quiet, dangerous way that always comes right before you learn something you can't unlearn. He was laughing softly, saying he couldn't believe how easy it had been, how I'd walked right into it, how the papers had practically signed themselves, and then he added, "Now all we need is a few more weeks, and she'll be out. Clean. Legal. No mess." I felt like my breath had turned to glass in my chest. He didn't say my name again, but he didn't have to. I knew exactly who he was talking about, and I knew, without needing another word, that everything I had quietly hoped was just a misunderstanding, or a phase, or a moment of distance, was actually a strategy, a timeline, a plan written with legal ink, and sealed with a smile that had never truly belonged to me. I backed away from the door like it might burn me if I stayed too close, moving up the stairs with the silent rhythm of someone walking through a nightmare they can't wake from. And once I was alone in the bedroom, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat down at the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, letting the words repeat in my mind until they lost their shape and became nothing but a cold, sick feeling under my skin. That night, I pretended everything was fine. I set the table, made small talk, kissed Jamie on the forehead, and asked him about his school project, and even laughed politely at a story David told that I barely heard, because my mind was already elsewhere, moving carefully through every memory, every moment, every hint I'd dismissed as paranoia or nerves, and fitting them together like jagged puzzle pieces that suddenly made sense now that I knew what picture they were forming. And once I knew, really knew, I made a decision, not the kind you announce or write down or scream into the wind, but the kind you bury deep behind your ribs, letting it grow quietly, day by day, until it's strong enough to carry you through the storm you now realize has already begun. I waited one more week, long enough to gather what I needed, to make the right calls, to speak with a woman whose number I'd found months ago on a folded scrap of paper in David's office, a woman whose name was Charlotte. She remembered me. She sounded surprised at first, then calm, almost relieved, and within 15 minutes of soft, careful conversation, she told me everything. How David had done the same thing before, not once, but twice. How he'd built trust, moved in, taken control of assets, isolated the women under the guise of love and family and legal protection, and always walked away richer, and never, until now, caught. I asked her why she never came forward. She told me she tried, but the man was clever, methodical, and always made sure there were no witnesses, no bruises, no letters, nothing to pin him with. only silence and misunderstandings, and women too ashamed to admit what had happened. But I wasn't ashamed. Not anymore. Because now I knew what he really was. And now I had what he never planned on: a clear voice, a sharp mind, and someone who could speak before it was too late. The next morning, after speaking to Charlotte, I woke with a calm I hadn't felt in months. Not the peaceful kind that comes with safety or comfort, but the cold, grounded kind that grows when pain sharpens into purpose, and your heart, instead of breaking, folds into something solid and focused. I moved through the house with quiet, deliberate care, smiling when Jamie asked for help with his shoes, humming softly as I packed his lunch, and nodding patiently as David kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, never once noticing the difference in my eyes or the subtle shift in the way I watched him, because men like him never expect the people they hurt to fight back. Not with strategy, not with patience, and certainly not with evidence. As soon as the door closed behind him, I called a friend of my mother's, a retired estate attorney who had always told me to reach out if I ever needed anything. And for the first time in my life, I took her up on the offer, not for someone else, but for myself, explaining only what was necessary, carefully laying out the situation, the documents I'd found, and the timeline of events that suddenly looked far too rehearsed to be coincidence. She didn't ask too many questions, only told me to gather everything I could: dates, receipts, emails, even casual texts, anything that hinted at the pattern, anything the thaum no oi, anything that contradicted the gentle story he'd been spinning since the day we met. And when I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not grief, but a quiet readiness, as if the part of me that had once doubted everything had finally gone still. That afternoon, I went to the small house I'd grown up in, the one I'd left behind too quickly after my mother passed, and walked through each room with a notebook in my hand, documenting every detail that proved I'd once had a home that belonged to me, proof that I wasn't just a visitor in this life, that I had history, property, responsibilities, and identity long before David swept in with promises and signatures and soft, manipulative smiles. I gathered what I could, including a locked file box my mother had tucked away in her sewing room that held every legal record from the past 10 years, including power of attorney, bank records, and even copies of my own will. Things I'd forgotten existed, but that now stood like armor around me. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I stayed with Melissa, my oldest friend, who hadn't heard from me in weeks and hugged me so tightly it almost made me cry, though I didn't tell her everything yet. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to be smart about what I revealed and when, needed to protect the plan now that it had started to take shape. The next day, I returned to David's house as if nothing had happened, kissed Jamie on the forehead, folded the laundry, and made dinner like always, pretending I hadn't spent the past 48 hours building a quiet case against the man who had spent months dismantling my life behind my back. Then something happened I hadn't expected. A small moment, almost a flicker, but it told me that the ground beneath his feet was finally beginning to shift. That evening, just after dinner, as Jamie was brushing his teeth upstairs, David asked if I'd spoken to anyone from my mother's circle lately, casually, with that forced lightness that only shows up when someone already suspects you're one step ahead. And though I kept my tone calm, I saw it in his eyes. The first flash of uncertainty, the faintest hesitation, like a man who finally realizes the game he thought he was winning is suddenly missing a piece. And that was the moment I knew I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was setting the stage. The quiet, careful revenge had begun. The day I filed the legal motion felt strangely ordinary on the outside, just another morning with sun through the curtains and birds outside the window, but inside me, every movement carried the weight of months lived under someone else's control. And as I walked into the county courthouse with a folder clutched tightly under my arm, I felt more steady than I had in a very long time, not fearless, not invincible, but ready in a way that didn't shake or flinch or look back. The lawyer my mother once trusted had reviewed everything with cold clarity, assembling the case like a puzzle whose final image could no longer be hidden. The rushed property transfer, the manipulation of financial assets, the isolation from old friends, and the pattern that Charlotte and two other women confirmed through notarized statements that painted a clear and chilling picture of a man who moved through women's lives, not out of love, but out of calculated gain. David was served 2 days later, and although he kept his expression composed as he opened the envelope on the front porch, I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten and the light in his eyes flicker with something darker than surprise, something closer to fear. He didn't speak to me that night, just paced the hallways while Jamie slept, and though I kept my movements quiet and simple, every second that passed added to the careful confidence I had built within myself. I knew this wouldn't be easy. I knew he would fight, charm, and manipulate his way through every loophole and shadow, but this time I had the truth, and I had names, records, timelines, and patterns that spoke louder than his smile ever could. The first court date came quickly, and I sat on the wooden bench in that quiet room with hands folded neatly in my lap and eyes steady, listening as David's lawyer spun his version of events, that I had been unstable, grieving, unsure of my place, and that the papers had been signed willingly, that everything had been discussed, and that I had simply changed my mind now that the relationship had shifted. I didn't react. I didn't flinch. I waited. And when it was our turn, my attorney stood and presented the stack of documents we had gathered. Not just my case, but statements from the other women who had come forward, one by one, brave enough now to say what they hadn't said before, and then came the moment that neither I nor David expected, when the judge paused, turned toward the gallery, and called Jamie's name. At first I panicked, my heart stuttering in my chest, because I hadn't known Jamie was even in the building, hadn't known that a quiet third party had requested a guardian ad litem, a child representative, to speak with him independently. And now, here he was, stepping up slowly with a folded paper in his hand and a nervous look in his eyes. Not coached, not rehearsed, just a boy who had seen more than anyone had realized. He told the court that he overheard things in the hallway at night, that his father had once joked with someone on the phone about getting rid of her without a mess, and that he didn't want to live in a house where people were used like toys and thrown away when they didn't sparkle anymore. That sentence, so simple, so raw, cracked the courtroom wide open. David's face went pale, and for the first time since I had met him, I watched his composure dissolve right there in front of strangers, the calm surface finally buckling under the weight of truth that had been pressing on it for too long. The judge ordered a full audit of all financial activity related to the property transfer and placed a temporary freeze on David's access to the home and any joint accounts, which meant that in one quiet moment, the power he had taken so carefully and quietly for months was suddenly no longer in his hands. And as I walked out of that courtroom, holding Jamie's hand in one and my lawyer's final report in the other, I felt something I hadn't dared let myself believe in for months, a breath of freedom, not the final kind, not yet, but the kind that tells you the door that was closed has begun to open again, slowly, steadily, and this time on your terms. Weeks passed, and the house that once held shadows began to feel different, not warm exactly, not yet, but lighter in the way that rooms do when someone who once carried control in their silence is no longer present to fill the air with their weight. And for the first time in months, I could walk barefoot through the hallway without checking over my shoulder, breathe in the kitchen without holding something in, and open the windows without fearing who might be watching, because David was gone, at least for now, his access legally blocked, his name under investigation, and the house returned to its rightful state, not because he gave it back, but because I fought for every signature, every clause, every inch of wood and memory and ground beneath it. And though the process wasn't over, I had already won something greater than any title: my voice. But the story didn't end there. A month later, just when things were beginning to settle and I had started building a new version of our life with Jamie, one that was slower, simpler, and stitched together with small kindnesses and shared healing, I received a package in the mail with no return address, sealed in a plain brown envelope and hand-delivered by courier. Inside, it was a single manila folder containing a notarized letter from a law firm out of state. And, as I read the first paragraph, my hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the weight of what it meant. It was a second will, not mine, not David's, but Vanessa's, his late wife. As it turned out, she had quietly updated her estate plan before her passing, placing the house and all attached assets in a protective trust for Jamie's future, and naming a private trustee to oversee it, should anything ever happen to her. The original copy had been buried beneath legal obstructions for over 2 years, but the firm had recently been alerted by Charlotte, who had finally gathered the courage to bring her files forward. And, with the legal audit of David now fully active, everything had come to light at once. In that moment, everything David had tried to take, not just from me, but from his own son, crumbled, not through revenge, not through anger, but through the quiet, patient truth of the woman who came before me. The woman who must have known, even as she smiled through her final days, that the man beside her was not the man she had once believed in. The trust had been violated, the funds misused, and the penalty for that went far beyond losing property. It meant legal charges, it meant financial restitution, it meant his carefully built facade wasn't just cracking, it was being peeled away layer by layer in front of every judge, every lawyer, every witness who once saw him as respectable. A formal hearing followed, and the evidence was overwhelming. The judge ruled in favor of the trust, stripped David of all remaining rights over the estate, and placed Jamie's guardianship under shared oversight between me and the trustee, an elderly woman named Eleanor, who had once been Vanessa's mentor and who, after hearing everything, insisted that I stay in the home as part of the boy's care, rent-free, with full authority over his well-being, schooling, and financial future. David's assets were frozen, his accounts audited, his reputation shattered, and for the first time since he'd tried to erase me, I watched him walk out of the courtroom with nothing in his hands and no ground beneath his feet. As for me, I didn't feel triumph in the loud, dramatic way I once imagined. I felt quiet, grounded, whole, not because he lost, but because I didn't let myself disappear. I rebuilt, not by screaming, but by standing, not by attacking, but by uncovering. And now, in the evenings, as Jamie reads quietly beside me and the wind moves through the house without tension, I sometimes catch myself looking around at the life I almost lost and whispering a silent promise to never ignore that small voice inside me again, the one that first said something wasn't right, the one that saved us both. And maybe that's the real justice, not just what they lose, but what we take back.